Michael Carter was a man who commanded respect, not just because of his title, but because of the life he had lived and the battles he had fought. As the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Michael had dedicated nearly 3 decades to upholding justice in America. He wasn't someone who sought fame or recognition. Instead, he preferred to stay out of the spotlight, focusing on dismantling corruption and ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. His reputation for fairness and integrity was unmatched, and even those who disagreed with his methods couldn't deny his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. On this particular evening, however, Michael wasn't thinking about work. For once, he wanted to step away from the chaos of Washington, D.C., if only for a few hours. He decided to visit a small diner located in a quiet town about an hour outside the city. It was a place he had heard about from colleagues, a cozy spot where locals gathered to share stories over plates of comfort food. The thought of sitting in a booth, sipping coffee, and enjoying a burger sounded like exactly what he needed after a long week of meetings and investigations. Michael slid behind the wheel of his sleek black sedan, a car that reflected his success without being overly flashy. As he drove through the winding roads leading to the town, he noticed how different everything felt compared to the bustling streets of the capital. Here, there were no towering skyscrapers or endless streams of traffic. Instead, there were wide-open fields, rows of modest houses, and signs welcoming visitors to a friendly community. But beneath the surface of this idyllic setting lay something darker, something Michael would soon discover firsthand. When Michael arrived at the diner, he parked his car along the curb near the entrance. The parking lot wasn't full, but there were enough vehicles to suggest the place was busy. Before stepping out, Michael glanced at himself in the rearview mirror. His suit jacket was neatly pressed, his tie slightly loosened after a day of wearing it tight around his neck. At 47 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen it all, yet remained hopeful for a better future. Satisfied with his appearance, he grabbed his wallet and phone and stepped out into the cool night air. As Michael locked his car, he didn't notice 2 figures approaching from across the street. They were local police officers, Officer Briggs and Officer Monroe, patrolling the area as part of their routine duties. Both men were veterans of the force, having served in the department for over 15 years. Over time, they had grown accustomed to wielding power in a town where accountability was rare. Their attitudes reflected this lack of oversight. They often acted as though they owned the streets, treating anyone they deemed suspicious with hostility. Briggs spotted Michael's car first. The shiny sedan stood out among the older trucks and sedans typically seen in the neighborhood. To Briggs, it looked out of place, almost as if it didn't belong here. He nudged Monroe, pointing toward the vehicle. "See that fancy ride?" Briggs muttered under his breath. "Bet you anything that guy doesn't live around here." Monroe squinted, studying the man now walking toward the diner. "Looks like trouble to me," he replied, his tone laced with disdain. "Probably thinks he's better than us, driving a car like that." Without hesitation, the 2 officers crossed the street, their boots thudding heavily against the pavement. By the time Michael reached the diner's door, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw the officers striding toward him with determined expressions. Something about their body language set off alarm bells in Michael's mind, but he remained calm, assuming they simply wanted to ask a question. "Evening, gentlemen," Michael said politely, offering a slight nod. "Can I help you?" Briggs stopped a few feet away, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered gun. Monroe stood slightly behind him, arms crossed over his chest. Neither man returned Michael's greeting. Instead, Briggs tilted his head, scrutinizing Michael from head to toe. "What are you doing here?" Briggs asked bluntly, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. "I'm here to grab dinner," Michael replied evenly, gesturing toward the diner. "Is there a problem?" Briggs ignored the question, choosing instead to focus on Michael's car. "That your vehicle?" he demanded, pointing toward the sedan. "Yes, it is," Michael confirmed, keeping his tone measured. "Why do you ask?" The officer exchanged a glance with Monroe before turning back to Michael. "You sure about that?" Briggs sneered, taking a step closer. "Because it looks kinda expensive for someone like you." Michael frowned, unsure whether he had heard correctly. Someone like me? He echoed, raising an eyebrow. I don't follow. Briggs smirked, clearly enjoying the exchange. You know what I mean, he said, letting the implication hang in the air. Folks around here don't drive cars like that. Not unless they're hiding something. Michael felt a surge of frustration but pushed it aside. He knew better than to let emotions cloud his judgment, especially when dealing with individuals who seemed eager to provoke him. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his wallet and flipped it open to reveal his FBI badge. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he said firmly, holding the badge up for them to see. My name is Michael Carter, and I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to go inside and eat my dinner. For a moment, silence fell between them. Briggs stared at the badge, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smirk crept back onto his face. Nice try, he scoffed, shaking his head. You really expect us to believe that? You're just some punk trying to pull a fast one. Michael blinked, surprised by the accusation. This isn't a joke, he insisted, his voice steady, despite the absurdity of the situation. Call headquarters if you need confirmation. They'll verify who I am. But Briggs wasn't listening. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath hot against Michael's face. Listen here, pal, he growled, jabbing a finger into Michael's chest. We don't care who you say you are. All we see is someone who doesn't belong here. So why don't you make things easier on yourself and come quietly? Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. He had faced far worse situations in his career, but there was something uniquely infuriating about being dismissed so blatantly. Still, he reminded himself that these men weren't worth losing control over. With deliberate movements, he placed his badge back into his wallet and slipped it into his pocket. If you want to arrest me, then do it, he said calmly. But I promise you, you'll regret this. Briggs laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that grated on Michael's nerves. Oh, we're gonna have fun with you, he said, signaling for Monroe to move in. Within seconds, Michael found himself shoved roughly against his car, his hands pinned behind his back as cold metal cuffs clicked into place around his wrists. As the officers tightened the cuffs, Michael winced but refused to give them the satisfaction of hearing him complain. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a small crowd gathering nearby, locals drawn by the commotion. Some looked concerned, while others seemed indifferent, content to watch the drama unfold. No one stepped forward to intervene, and Michael understood why. In a town like this, speaking out against authority could come with consequences. Briggs leaned in close again, his lips curling into a sneer. You think you're smart, huh? He spat, his words dripping with venom. Well, let's see how smart you feel when we throw your sorry self in a cell. Michael didn't respond. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, knowing that reacting emotionally would only make the situation worse. Little did Briggs and Monroe realize, however, that the real story was just beginning, and it wouldn't end the way they expected. The night air was cool, but Michael could feel the heat rising in his chest as the two officers tightened the handcuffs around his wrists. The cuffs dug into his skin, not because they were applied with care, but because they were meant to humiliate and intimidate. Briggs stood inches away from him, his breath hot and heavy with arrogance. Monroe loomed behind, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a predator observing its prey. Neither man seemed concerned about protocol or basic human decency. To them, Michael wasn't a person. He was an object to be controlled, a problem to be dealt with however they saw fit. Let's see how tough you are now, Briggs sneered, giving Michael a sharp push against the car. The force of the shove caused Michael's shoulder to slam painfully into the doorframe. He gritted his teeth but didn't make a sound. Years of training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but this situation tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. These weren't just rogue cops, they were bullies hiding behind badges, emboldened by years of unchecked power. As Briggs leaned closer, his tone grew nastier. You think flashing some fake ID is going to save you? he taunted, grabbing Michael's wallet from his pocket and flipping it open again. He held up the badge for Monroe to see, waving it dismissively. "Look at this thing. It's probably something he bought off the internet." Monroe snickered, shaking his head. "Yeah, real. Convincing," he chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Next he'll tell us he's the president or something." Michael clenched his jaw, fighting back the urge to respond. He knew arguing would only fuel their hostility. Instead, he focused on breathing deeply, reminding himself that these men were cowards at heart. They thrived on fear and submission, and showing weakness would only encourage them further. Still, it was hard not to react when Briggs pressed harder, his face inches away from Michael's. "You know what I think?" Briggs continued, his voice rising. "I think you're nothing but a liar, a thief who stole that car and thought you could pass yourself off as somebody important." He paused, leaning back slightly to study Michael with mock curiosity. "What do you have to say for yourself, huh? Or are you too scared to talk?" Michael met his gaze directly, his eyes steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "I've already told you who I am," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And if you'd bothered to check, you'd know I'm telling the truth. But go ahead, arrest me. Let's see where this gets you." Briggs frowned, caught off guard by Michael's composure. Most people in this situation would have been pleading or panicking, but Michael's calm demeanor unnerved him. For a split second, doubt flickered across his face. Then almost instinctively he shook it off, doubling down on his aggression. "Oh, we're arresting you, all right," he snapped, shoving Michael again. "But first we're going to teach you a lesson about lying to cops." The crowd that had gathered nearby watched silently, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some looked uneasy, perhaps sensing that something wasn't right about the way the officers were treating Michael. Others seemed indifferent, content to let the drama play out without getting involved. No one stepped forward to intervene, not even when Briggs pulled Michael away from the car and began patting him down roughly, searching for anything he could use to justify their actions. Michael endured the search stoically, his mind racing as Briggs rifled through his pockets. His phone, keys, and wallet were dumped unceremoniously onto the hood of the car. Briggs picked up the phone, examining it closely before tossing it aside. "Locked, huh?" he muttered, glaring at Michael. "Figures." Michael didn't respond. He knew better than to engage further. Instead, he focused on maintaining his dignity, refusing to let these men break him. But inside, his frustration simmered. How could anyone abuse their authority so blatantly? What gave them the right to treat another human being this way? Just then, Briggs had an idea. A cruel smile spread across his face as he turned to Monroe. "Hey, remember that guy last month who got busted for possession?" he asked casually, his tone light but menacing. "The one with the fancy car and no record? This guy looks exactly like him." Monroe chuckled, catching on immediately. "Yeah, funny how things work out," he replied, playing along. "Maybe our friend here decided to try the same trick." Briggs nodded, turning back to Michael with a predatory gleam in his eye. "Tell you what," he said, leaning in close again. "We can make this easy for you, or we can make it hard. Your choice." Michael stared at him, refusing to rise. To the bait. "Make what easy?" he asked calmly, though he already suspected what was coming next. Briggs smirked, clearly enjoying the game. "Here's the deal," he said, lowering his voice so only Michael could hear. "If you hand over 50 grand in cash right now, we'll forget this whole thing ever happened. No arrest, no charges, no fuss, but if you don't..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Michael felt a surge of anger but kept his expression neutral. Extortion. These men weren't just corrupt. They were criminals masquerading as law enforcement. "You're asking me to pay you off?" he said slowly, his tone icy. "For what? Arresting me for doing absolutely nothing wrong?" Briggs shrugged, feigning innocence. "Hey, don't shoot the messenger," he said with a grin. "You brought this on yourself. All you gotta do is cooperate and we'll let you walk away." Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the growing crowd, searching for any sign of support. But the faces staring back at him offered little comfort. Most people looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. A few whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. It was clear that no one was going to step in, not here, not now. Realizing he was on his own, Michael turned his attention back to Briggs. Even if I had the money, which I don't, it wouldn't change the fact that you're breaking the law, he said firmly, his voice carrying a note of authority. You realize that, right? Everything you're doing right now is illegal. Briggs laughed, throwing his head back as if he'd heard the funniest joke in the world. Illegal? He echoed, his tone mocking. Who's gonna stop us? You? Monroe joined in, chuckling darkly. Yeah, good luck with that, he added, shaking his head. By the time anyone figures out what's going on, we'll be long gone, and you'll be rotting in a cell. Michael didn't respond. Instead, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. These men were desperate, willing to cross any line to protect their fragile egos. But desperation made people reckless, and recklessness led to mistakes. And Michael knew firsthand that even the smallest mistake could unravel everything. As Briggs and Monroe debated what to do next, Michael subtly shifted his weight, angling his body slightly toward his phone. Earlier, when Briggs had tossed it onto the car, he hadn't noticed that the screen lit up briefly, a sign that the device was still active. Michael had set it to record automatically whenever it detected movement, a habit he'd developed during undercover operations. If the recording captured everything that had happened so far, it could serve as undeniable proof of their misconduct. Briggs finally made up his mind, turning back to Michael with a smug expression. All right, here's the plan, he announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Since you're obviously not going to cooperate, we're taking you downtown. And trust me, things are going to get a lot worse for you once we get there. Michael nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Fine, he said simply. Take me wherever you want, but I promise you, you'll regret this. Briggs rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. Yeah, save the speeches for someone who cares, he muttered, yanking Michael away from the car. Let's go. As they dragged him toward their patrol car, Michael allowed himself a small, inward smile. These men thought they had the upper hand, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had underestimated him, and that was a mistake they would soon regret. The patrol car smelled of stale coffee and old leather, a scent that would have been unpleasant under any other circumstances. But Michael barely noticed it. His mind was racing, calculating every possible move he could make to turn the tables on Briggs and Monroe. As they shoved him into the back seat, he kept his expression neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear or frustration. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like he was resigned to his fate. But inside, Michael was anything but. Briggs slammed the door shut with unnecessary force before climbing into the driver's seat. Monroe took the passenger side, twisting around to glare at Michael through the metal grate, separating the front and back of the vehicle. You better hope we don't find anything incriminating when we search your car, Monroe said, his tone dripping with menace. Because if we do, you're gonna wish you'd never been born. Michael didn't respond. He simply stared straight ahead, his posture relaxed despite the tension in the air. Inside his head, however, he was piecing together the next steps. The recording on his phone was still running. He was certain of it. Every insult, every threat, every illegal demand had been captured. That knowledge gave him a small measure of comfort. But he knew he couldn't rely solely on the recording. He needed to ensure there was no room for doubt, no loophole these men could exploit to wriggle free. As the car pulled away from the curb, Briggs glanced at Monroe. What about the phone? He asked, nodding toward the device sitting on the hood of Michael's sedan. Should we grab it? Monroe hesitated, frowning slightly. I don't know, he admitted. It looked locked. If it's got biometric security, we can't access it without his face or fingerprint. Briggs groaned, clearly annoyed. Great, so what? We just leave it there? Someone could take it. Michael listened carefully, keeping his breathing steady. He had anticipated this moment, the moment when they realized the phone might hold evidence against them. It was why he hadn't fought them when they confiscated it earlier. By leaving it behind, he had bought himself time and created an opportunity to keep the recording safe until he could retrieve it. "Fine," Briggs muttered after a pause. "We'll deal with it later. Right now, let's get him processed." He pressed harder on the accelerator, speeding up as they headed toward the station. The ride was tense, with neither officer speaking much beyond occasional muttered insults directed at Michael. They treated him like cargo, something to be transported, rather than a person deserving of basic respect. Occasionally, one of them would glance back at him in the rearview mirror, as though expecting him to crack under pressure. But Michael remained silent, his calm demeanor unshaken. When they arrived at the station, a drab gray building surrounded by flickering streetlights, Briggs parked haphazardly near the entrance. Before getting out, he turned to look at Michael, his lip curling into a sneer. "This is your last chance," he said, leaning close enough for Michael to see the veins bulging in his neck. "Give us the money, and we'll forget this ever happened. Otherwise," he let the sentence trail off, leaving the threat hanging heavy in the air. Michael met his gaze evenly, his voice steady and firm. "I told you already, I don't have the money, and even if I did, I wouldn't give it to criminals like you." For a moment, Briggs looked stunned. Then anger flashed across his face, raw and ugly. "Criminals?" he spat, incredulous. "You're calling us criminals, after everything you've done?" "I haven't done anything," Michael replied coolly. "But you've broken multiple laws tonight. Assault, false arrest, extortion. The list goes on. And trust me, when this is over, you'll pay for every single one of them." Briggs clenched, his jaw, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a second, it seemed like he might lash out physically. But then Monroe spoke up, his voice sharp and commanding. "Enough," he snapped. "We're wasting time. Let's get him inside." Reluctantly, Briggs nodded, stepping out of the car and yanking open the back door. He grabbed Michael roughly by the arm, dragging him out onto the pavement. The cold night air hit Michael's face, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the scene unfolding around him. The parking lot was deserted except for a few other patrol cars, their lights casting long shadows across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its sound echoing eerily in the quiet night. Inside the station, the atmosphere was no less hostile. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating a cramped, cluttered room filled with desks, filing cabinets, and posters warning about various crimes. A handful of officers sat scattered throughout the space, some typing reports, others chatting idly. When Briggs and Monroe marched Michael through the door, all eyes turned to them. "Who's this?" one officer asked, raising an eyebrow as he studied Michael. "Just some guy who thought he could pull a fast one," Briggs replied dismissively, shoving Michael toward a holding cell in the corner of the room. "We'll sort him out later." Michael stumbled slightly but quickly regained his footing. He scanned the area, noting the lack of surveillance cameras in key locations. This wasn't surprising. Smaller departments often operated with limited resources, which meant oversight was minimal at best. It also meant that misconduct could go unchecked for years, festering like an untreated wound. Once inside the cell, Briggs slammed the barred door shut with a clang that reverberated through the room. "Enjoy your stay," he sneered, turning to walk away. Monroe lingered for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, without saying a word, he followed Briggs back to the main area of the station. Alone now, Michael allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He leaned against the cold metal bars, closing his eyes as he exhaled slowly. Despite the dire situation, he felt a strange sense of clarity. These men had underestimated him, assuming he was powerless because of their authority. But Michael knew better. He had spent decades building a reputation based on integrity and justice, and he wasn't about to let two corrupt officers destroy it. His thoughts drifted back to the phone. If the recording was still intact, it would serve as irrefutable proof of their wrongdoing. But retrieving it wouldn't be easy, not with Briggs and Monroe watching his every move. He needed a way to tip off someone outside the station, someone who could act quickly and discreetly. That's when inspiration struck. Earlier that day, Michael had synced his phone to his smartwatch using a secure app designed for emergencies. The app allowed him to send pre-written messages to trusted contacts with the press of a button. All he needed to do was activate it, and hope that help arrived before things escalated further. Carefully, Michael shifted his position, angling his wrist toward the dim light filtering into the cell. With subtle movements, he tapped the screen of his watch, selecting the emergency contact option. Within seconds, a silent alert pinged FBI headquarters, notifying them of his location and situation. Now all he had to do was wait. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly. Outside the cell, Briggs and Monroe continued their routine, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. They joked with their colleagues, laughed at crude jokes, and sipped coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. Meanwhile, Michael remained patient, biding his time until reinforcements arrived. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. At first, Briggs and Monroe didn't react, assuming it was another patrol car returning from duty. But as the noise grew louder, they exchanged confused glances. "What's going on?" Briggs muttered, standing up to peer out the window. Before either man could answer, the front doors burst open, and a team of federal agents stormed into the station, weapons drawn. "FBI!" one agent shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone freeze!" Pandemonium erupted as the officers scrambled to comply, their faces pale with shock. Briggs and Monroe stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" Briggs stammered, looking from one agent to another. "You can't just barge in here like this." One of the agents stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights. "We're here for Director Carter," he announced, his tone authoritative. "And we're placing you both under arrest for assault, false imprisonment, and extortion." Michael watched from the cell as the agents moved swiftly, cuffing Briggs and Monroe before reading them their rights. The two officers struggled briefly, protesting loudly, but their efforts were futile. Within moments, they were being led away, their bravado replaced by panic. As the commotion died down, an agent approached Michael's cell, unlocking the door. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Michael nodded, stepping out into the open. "I'm fine," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But this isn't over yet, not by a long shot." The station was eerily quiet now, the chaos of moments ago replaced by a tense stillness. The federal agents moved with precision, securing the area and ensuring no evidence could be tampered with. Briggs and Monroe were already in handcuffs, their faces pale and sweaty as they sat slumped on chairs in the corner of the room, guarded by two stern-looking agents. Their earlier bravado had evaporated completely, leaving behind only fear and desperation. Every few seconds, one of them would glance nervously at Michael, as if hoping for mercy, or maybe just an explanation. Michael stood near the center of the room, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. He wasn't celebrating. He never did when justice caught up to someone. Instead, he felt a deep weariness settling over him, the kind that came from knowing how much damage unchecked power could do. These men weren't anomalies, they were symptoms of a larger problem, one that stretched far beyond this small-town police department. One of the lead agents approached Michael, holding out a tablet. "Sir, we've retrieved the recording from your phone," he said, his tone respectful but urgent. "It's all there. Every word, every threat. We're preparing to review it thoroughly before releasing it as part of the investigation." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said simply. "Make sure nothing is left out. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated this way and couldn't fight back." The agent hesitated, glancing at Briggs and Monroe before lowering his voice. "Do you want us to handle the public statement, or would you prefer to address it yourself?" For a moment, Michael didn't answer. He looked around the room, at the frightened officers, the scattered papers on desks, the faint stains on the walls that hinted at years of neglect. Then he turned back to the agent. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "This needs to come directly from me. People deserve to hear the truth, not just what happened tonight, but why it matters." The agent nodded, clearly relieved. "Understood, sir." We'll coordinate with communications to prepare everything. In the meantime, we'll process these two and begin gathering statements from the other officers." As the agent walked away, Michael took a deep breath, letting the weight of the situation sink in. He knew what came next wouldn't be easy. The recording would spark outrage, not just locally but across the country. News outlets would pick up the story within hours, dissecting every detail and demanding answers. And while the spotlight would shine brightly on Briggs and Monroe, Michael also understood that it would cast a shadow over law enforcement as a whole, a reminder of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Briggs suddenly spoke up, his voice trembling. "Director Carter, please," he begged, leaning forward despite the agent blocking his path. "You don't understand. We didn't mean any harm. We were just doing our jobs." Michael turned to face him, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Doing your jobs?" he repeated, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to abuse, intimidate, or extort innocent people. What you did tonight has nothing to do with justice. It's corruption, plain and simple." Monroe chimed in, his tone desperate. "Look, we made a mistake, okay? Everyone makes mistakes. You can't ruin our lives over this." Michael studied them for a moment, his expression softening slightly, but only slightly. "Mistakes are one thing," he said evenly. "But what you did tonight wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to ignore the law. You chose to use your badges as weapons instead of symbols of trust. And now you'll have to live with the consequences of those choices." The silence that followed was deafening. Briggs and Monroe exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with regret, but it was too late for apologies. The damage had been done not just to Michael but to the community they were supposed to serve. As the agents led them out of the station, neither man dared to look back. A moment of reflection. Once the immediate crisis was resolved, Michael stepped outside into the cool night air. The parking lot was empty now, save for the federal vehicles and his own sedan, which had been untouched since the ordeal began. He walked slowly toward his car, his mind replaying the events of the evening. It was surreal, almost dreamlike to think that just hours ago, he had been planning a quiet dinner, and now, he was at the center of a national scandal. He reached the driver's side door and paused, resting one hand on the roof of the car. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. He thought about the countless individuals who had endured similar treatment, but hadn't had the resources or platform to fight back. He thought about the families torn apart by systemic racism and corruption, the lives derailed by unchecked authority, and he thought about the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders, to ensure that this incident didn't fade into obscurity, forgotten once the headlines moved on to the next big story. "Director Carter?" a voice called softly from behind him. Michael turned to see Agent Rodriguez, one of the younger members of the team, standing a few feet away. She held a folder in her hands, her expression hesitant but determined. "We've compiled preliminary reports on the officers involved," she explained, "and we've identified several patterns of misconduct dating back years. It seems this isn't the first time something like this has happened here." Michael sighed, nodding gravely. "I suspected as much," he admitted. "Small towns like this often fly under the radar. No one pays attention until something blows up." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, clutching the folder tighter. "What happens now, sir? I mean, legally we've got them on multiple charges. But what about the bigger picture? How do we stop this from happening again?" It was a question Michael had asked himself countless times throughout his career. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, but he believed in progress, even if it came slowly. "We start by shining a light on the truth," he said after a moment. "People need to see what happened here, not just the facts, but the impact. We push for reforms, hold departments accountable, and create systems that prioritize transparency and fairness. It won't happen overnight, but every step forward counts." Rodriguez nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And what about you, sir? Are you going to be okay?" Michael managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll be fine," he assured her. "This wasn't about me, it never was. It was about making sure no one else has to go through what I did tonight. With that, he opened the car door and slid inside, starting the engine. As he drove away from the station, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the flashing lights of the federal vehicles grow smaller in the distance. Ahead of him lay a long road, one filled with challenges, resistance, and hard conversations. But Michael had faced worse, and he knew he wouldn't be walking it alone. Change was possible, however difficult it might seem. And sometimes, all it took was one person brave enough to stand up and say, "Enough." The ripple effect. By morning, the story had exploded. News outlets across the nation carried headlines detailing the arrest of Briggs and Monroe, along with excerpts from the damning recording. Social media buzzed with reactions, ranging from outrage to disbelief to calls for widespread reform. Protesters gathered outside police stations in major cities, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and no more corruption." Conversations about accountability and systemic racism dominated talk shows, podcasts, and online forums. At FBI headquarters, Michael met with his senior staff to discuss the next steps. They reviewed the evidence, planned press conferences, and coordinated with local authorities to implement new training programs aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. It was exhausting work, but Michael refused to let fatigue slow him down. He knew this was a pivotal moment, an opportunity to drive real change. As the day wore on, Michael found himself reflecting on the courage of ordinary citizens who had shared their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Some reached out privately, sending messages of support and gratitude. Others posted videos online, recounting their experiences in hopes of inspiring others to speak up. Each story reinforced Michael's belief that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about lifting up those who had been silenced for too long. When the meeting finally ended, Michael returned to his office, closing the door behind him. He sank into his chair, staring at the stack of files on his desk. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Somewhere out there, someone was watching the news, hearing his story, and realizing that they weren't powerless, that speaking out could make a difference. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity, both for Michael and the nation at large. The story of what had happened in that small-town police station dominated headlines, sparking debates in living rooms, classrooms, and legislative chambers across the country. For many, it was a wake-up call, a stark reminder of how deeply rooted issues of racism and corruption still were within law enforcement agencies. For others, it was a moment of vindication, proof that standing up to injustice could lead to real change. Michael spent most of his time navigating the storm, balancing the demands of public scrutiny with the need to push forward meaningful reforms. Every morning began with a flurry of meetings, some with federal officials, others with civil rights leaders, community activists, and even representatives from law enforcement unions. Each group brought its own perspective to the table, but they all shared one thing: an acknowledgement that something needed to be done. At first, Michael struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of requests pouring in. Reporters camped outside FBI headquarters, eager for sound bites or exclusive interviews. Politicians called incessantly, seeking guidance on how to spin the narrative in their favor. And then there were the letters, hundreds of them arriving daily, written by ordinary citizens who wanted to share their stories, express gratitude, or simply vent their frustrations. Some messages were heartbreaking, detailing years of harassment or abuse at the hands of those sworn to protect them. Others were hopeful, thanking Michael for inspiring courage in people who had long felt powerless. Despite the chaos, Michael approached each task with the same level of focus and determination he had shown during the incident itself. He knew this wasn't just about punishing Briggs and Monroe. It was about addressing the systemic failures that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. But as much as he wanted to tackle every issue head-on, he also understood the importance of pacing himself. Change took time, and rushing into decisions without careful consideration could do more harm than good. Public reaction and pushback. Not everyone welcomed the spotlight being shone on law enforcement misconduct. Predictably, some segments of society pushed back against the narrative taking shape in the media. Talk radio hosts dismissed the incident as an isolated case, accusing Michael of exaggerating its significance to further a political agenda. Media trolls flooded comment sections with vitriol, questioning everything from his motives to the authenticity of the recording, even within certain corners of law enforcement. Whispers of discontent spread among officers who felt unfairly targeted by the growing calls for reform. Michael saw all of this unfold, but refused to let it derail him. He understood that resistance was inevitable when confronting deeply entrenched systems of power. What mattered most was staying grounded in the truth and continuing to advocate for solutions that prioritized justice over convenience. One particularly heated exchange occurred during a televised town hall meeting organized by a prominent news network. The moderator invited a panel of guests to discuss the fallout from the incident, including Michael, a retired police chief, and a criminal justice professor. From the start, tensions ran high, with each participant bringing their own biases and priorities to the conversation. The retired police chief argued vehemently that incidents like this were rare exceptions rather than reflections of widespread problems. "You can't paint an entire profession with the same brush because of two bad apples," he said, pointing directly at Michael. "Law enforcement officers put their lives on the line every day to keep communities safe. We should be supporting them, not tearing them down." Michael listened patiently before responding, his tone measured but firm. "I agree that the vast majority of officers are honorable individuals who serve with integrity," he said. "But honor doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by the environment in which people operate. If we allow toxic cultures to fester, if we turn a blind eye to misconduct or fail to hold wrongdoers accountable, we're complicit in perpetuating harm." The audience erupted into applause, underscoring the divide between those clinging to old ways of thinking and those ready for change. Still, Michael knew that winning hearts and minds wouldn't happen overnight. It required patience, persistence, and a willingness to listen, even to those whose views clashed sharply with his own. Building bridges to address the backlash, Michael decided to take a different approach. Rather than engaging solely through press conferences and interviews, he began visiting communities affected by similar cases of police misconduct. His goal was simple: to hear directly from the people most impacted and to amplify their voices in spaces where they often went unheard. His first stop was a mid-sized city several hours away, where residents had recently protested after a young black man was fatally shot by police during a traffic stop. The mood in the community was tense, with mistrust running deep between locals and law enforcement. When Michael arrived, flanked by a small team of aides, he was greeted cautiously, but respectfully, by a group of organizers who had been leading the demonstrations. Over the course of 2 days, Michael attended town halls, met with grieving families, and listened intently as survivors recounted their experiences. One woman, a mother of 3, described how her teenage son had been stopped multiple times for no reason other than the color of his skin. Another man spoke of losing his brother to police violence years earlier, only to see the case swept under the rug due to lack of evidence. Each story left an indelible mark on Michael, reinforcing his belief that systemic change couldn't wait. By the end of his visit, he stood alongside local leaders at a press conference, announcing plans to partner with the Department of Justice to investigate patterns of misconduct in the area. "We owe it to these families, and to countless others, like them, to ensure that justice is served," he declared, his voice steady despite the weight of emotion behind his words. Legal consequences for Briggs and Monroe. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against Briggs and Monroe moved swiftly. Both men were denied bail after prosecutors argued they posed a flight risk and a threat to public safety. Their court appearances drew massive crowds, with supporters of accountability packing the courtroom, while relatives of the accused sat quietly in the back rows, visibly shaken. During preliminary hearings, prosecutors presented damning evidence, including the audio recording, witness statements, and internal documents revealing previous complaints filed against the officers. Defense attorneys attempted to cast doubt on the authenticity of the recording, claiming it had been tampered with, but forensic experts quickly debunked their claims. As the case unfolded, Briggs and Monroe became pariahs in the very community they had once policed. Former colleagues distanced themselves publicly, fearing association with the disgraced duo might tarnish their own reputations. Local businesses removed photos of the officers from walls adorned with Officer of the Wheel month plaques, scrubbing any trace of their involvement. For Michael, watching the trial unfold was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication knowing that justice was being served. On the other, he couldn't shake the sadness that came with seeing human beings reduced to symbols of failure, products of a broken system that had failed not only their victims but also themselves. A national movement takes shape back in Washington, D.C. Michael used his platform to champion broader reforms aimed at preventing future abuses of power. Working closely with lawmakers, he helped draft legislation designed to increase transparency within police departments, mandate body cameras for all officers, and establish independent oversight boards to review cases of alleged misconduct. The bill faced fierce opposition from lobbying groups representing police unions, who argued that increased regulation would hinder officers' ability to perform their duties effectively. But Michael remained undeterred, leveraging his credibility to rally support from both sides of the aisle. Slowly but surely, momentum began to build, fueled by grassroots activism and mounting public pressure. By the time the bill passed, a historic victory celebrated nationwide. Michael stood alongside the president as it was signed into law. Cameras flashed as he shook hands with legislators, activists, and survivors of police brutality, their faces lighting up with hope for a better future. Yet even amid the celebration, Michael kept his emotions in check. He knew this was just the beginning. Laws alone couldn't erase centuries of inequality or undo decades of mistrust. Real change required sustained effort, collaboration, and a collective commitment to doing what was right, not just for today, but for generations to come. As he walked away from the ceremony, surrounded by cheers and applause, Michael allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Somewhere out there, a young person was watching, inspired by the courage of someone willing to stand up and demand justice, and that, more than anything, gave him hope. The weeks following the passage of the landmark police reform bill were a mix of triumph and introspection for Michael Carter. While the nation celebrated the historic legislation, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here and the work that still lay ahead. Change was never linear, he reminded himself. It ebbed and flowed, requiring constant vigilance to ensure progress didn't stall or reverse. Michael returned to his quiet routines after the whirlwind of media appearances and public events subsided. He spent mornings reviewing reports from task forces monitoring compliance with the new laws, ensuring departments across the country implemented reforms effectively. Afternoons were reserved for meetings with advocacy groups, where he listened to feedback from communities directly impacted by policing practices. And evenings? Those were for solitude, moments when he could step away from the weight of responsibility and simply breathe. A personal reflection one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the skyline of Washington, D.C., Michael sat on the porch of his modest home. The house was far smaller than what most people expected of someone in his position, but it suited him perfectly. It was cozy, unassuming, and filled with memories of family gatherings and quiet weekends spent reading. He leaned back in his chair, sipping a cup of tea while flipping through an old photo album. The pages were worn, edges frayed from years of handling. Each picture told a story. His parents standing proudly outside their church, his younger self graduating from college and later joining the FBI Academy. There was also a faded snapshot of his late wife, Sarah, smiling brightly at the camera during one of their vacations. She had always been his rock, the person who grounded him when the world felt overwhelming. Losing her to illness years ago had left a void he still carried, but tonight, surrounded by reminders of happier times, he felt closer to her than ever. As he turned another page, his eyes landed on a photograph taken during his early days as an agent. In it, he stood alongside colleagues after successfully dismantling a major corruption ring. They looked exhausted but triumphant, their faces glowing with pride. That case had been a turning point in his career, cementing his belief that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about restoring faith in institutions meant to protect everyone equally. Tonight, however, Michael couldn't help but wonder if he'd done enough. Yes, Briggs and Monroe were behind bars, and yes, sweeping reforms were underway. But systemic issues ran deep, and no single victory could erase centuries of inequality. Still, he reminded himself of something Sarah used to say: "Progress isn't perfect, but it's worth fighting for." Her words echoed in his mind, grounding him once again, inspiring the next generation. The next morning, Michael received an invitation he hadn't anticipated. A local high school in the same town where the incident had occurred reached out, asking if he would speak at their annual leadership conference. The theme this year was Courage in Action, and they hoped his story might inspire students to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. At first, Michael hesitated. Public speaking had never been his favorite activity, especially in front of teenagers whose energy often intimidated adults twice their age. But then, he remembered the letters he'd received from young people thanking him for giving them hope. Maybe, he thought, this was an opportunity to plant seeds of change in the next generation. When the day arrived, Michael walked onto the stage of the auditorium to thunderous applause. Hundreds of students filled the seats, their faces eager and curious. Teachers lined the walls, watching intently as he adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. "Good morning," he began, his voice warm and inviting. "I want to start by saying how honored I am to be here today. You've chosen a powerful theme, courage, and I believe there's no better time to talk about courage than now." For the next hour, Michael shared his story, not just the dramatic events of that fateful night, but also the quieter moments that shaped his perspective. He spoke about growing up in a neighborhood where trust in law enforcement was scarce, about losing loved ones to senseless violence, and about dedicating his life to creating a fairer system. He emphasized the importance of resilience, empathy, and integrity, urging the students to use their voices to advocate for justice. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Dozens of hands shot up during the Q&A session, each student eager to ask questions or share their thoughts. One young boy, barely 13, stood up nervously and asked, "What do you do when you're scared? How do you keep going?" Michael smiled gently, leaning forward slightly to make eye contact. "Fear is natural," he said. "It means you care deeply about what's at stake. The key is not letting fear control you. Instead, let it remind you why you're fighting. For yourself, for others, for a better future." The boy nodded slowly, a look of determination spreading across his face. It was a small moment, but one that stuck with Michael long after the event ended. A national memorial in the months that followed, Michael spearheaded another initiative, one close to his heart. Alongside civil rights organizations and families affected by police brutality, he helped establish a national memorial dedicated to victims of misconduct. Located in a park near the Lincoln Memorial, the site featured engraved plaques bearing the names of those whose lives had been lost, along with quotes emphasizing unity, compassion, and accountability. On the day of its unveiling, thousands gathered to pay tribute. Survivors delivered speeches, artists performed moving tributes, and candles flickered softly in the cool autumn breeze. As Michael addressed the crowd, his voice carried a mix of sorrow and resolve. "This memorial isn't just a reminder of pain," he said, gesturing toward the plaques. "It's a call to action, a promise that we will honor these lives by working tirelessly to prevent similar tragedies. Justice isn't achieved overnight, but every step forward brings us closer to the world we envision." Among the attendees was a young black boy named Marcus, who clutched his mother's hand tightly as he listened to Michael's words. Earlier that year, Marcus's older brother had been detained under questionable circumstances, leaving the family traumatized. Seeing Michael, a man who looked like him and had faced similar struggles, standing tall and advocating for change ignited a spark within him. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus approached Michael shyly, holding out a drawing he'd made of the memorial. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the dispersing crowd. Michael knelt down to meet Marcus's gaze, accepting the artwork with a smile. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. "Because of kids like you, I know our future is in good hands." Looking ahead as winter approached, Michael prepared to step back slightly from the spotlight. He knew the fight for justice required fresh voices and new ideas, and he was determined to pass the torch to emerging leaders ready to carry the mantle. At the same time, he remained committed to mentoring and supporting grassroots efforts aimed at fostering trust between communities and law enforcement. One snowy afternoon, as he strolled through the park near his home, Michael paused beside a bench overlooking a frozen pond. Children laughed and skated nearby, their joy infectious. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different kind of world, one where fear didn't dictate interactions between citizens and officers, where accountability was the norm rather than the exception, and where everyone felt safe regardless of the color of their skin. It was a vision worth striving for, he thought. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, Michael knew one thing for certain. True change started with those brave enough to confront injustice and continue walking forward, no matter how difficult the path. With that thought, he buttoned his coat against the chill and headed home, ready to face whatever Tom